Hello everyone, how's it going? Hope you're having a wonderful day. Now before I start this video, I want to establish that technically I am part of IGN's freelance program for video editing and walkthroughs, and I am part of Capcom's creators program, so I want to establish that before I start this video, before people start saying I'm biased in some way. But I'm probably going to be very critical of this article. There was a video that came up of this article, so I kind of know what we're about to read. But regardless, what we're talking about here is Resident Evil 5. Now, Resident Evil 5 is anticipated to be the next remake in Capcom's very successful remakes of the Resident Evil franchise. And even when Resident Evil 5 came out, it was very divisive. From a gameplay standpoint, a lot of people weren't a fan of the heavy action focus that it took. It was hugely successful commercially, but over time, a lot of people have come to appreciate Resident Evil 5. I would argue, yeah, it's a lot better than I remember it. Granted, it's still an action horror game, but it's quite fun, and I would say that the lore, if the game is actually very well done, especially like the infected they play within the game. But even then, there was also, even during when the game came out, there was this hot debate of whether the game was racist or not. Now, I know that seems utterly stupid because even back then I thought it was stupid, and even now I think it's stupid. People thought it was very wrong that Chris Redfield, being a white person, was shooting Africans in Africa who had been infected and became hostilely violent people. And they never really mentioned Sheva she's a native-born African. And they also had a problem with Sheva, where an alternate costume of hers allowed her to dress in a tribal outfit, which, again, she's African, so of course she would have an outfit that probably projects her people in a much more authentic way. Either way, it was just like this whole collection of nonsense that a lot of people just thought of it as complete garbage. But now that Resident Evil 5 is highly anticipated, the remake at least, because it's, they've been killing it with the Resident Evil remakes. Resident Evil 3, not so much, but Resident Evil 4 was absolutely exceptional, and I can't wait to see. I did get review codes for Resident Evil 4 Remake and the DLC, so want to establish that, but I like the game so much, I got a physical copy. I like having physical games over digital games, as you can tell. These are mostly just Switch games, but you get what I'm saying. But we're going to read this article, and yeah, we're going to go through the entire thing. With Resident Evil 4 released last year, Capcom projects to remake the glory years of survival horror series is complete, but as the game's post-credits scene suggests, the remakes aren't over, as so the big question is where's next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5, but on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remake into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay narrative decisions best left in the past. Now, yeah, some people would say that because after Resident Evil 5 came out, Resident Evil 6 came out, and wow, that was just full-blown action. I believe it was one of Capcom's most expensive projects. Eventually, it did make its money back, but I think the game is also, remembered too harshly. I think it's actually pretty good, but there's no question behind it that it wasn't really a horror game. It was it was an action game, especially the Sherry and Jake Mueller situation where they just decided we're going to make a Call of Duty game at that point. But yeah. And so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite. Resident Evil is a survival horror series, not that you would know it by playing Resident Evil 5. Well, I wouldn't call it a survival horror series anymore. Like, Resident Evil 5 has so many features to it. It even had a freaking light gun game. Like, it's actually very underappreciated, but I would say Resident Evil is a horror franchise. It's no longer a survival horror game franchise. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but RE5 is an action game through and through. Yeah, and they don't hide that at all. They really showcase that from the beginning of the game, and I give Capcom credit for that. They doubled down on the action part. They didn't try to mix together horror stuff within the game's core campaign. They decided, this is an action game, that's what it's going to be. I actually wish more games did that. They didn't do like something... There's something here for everyone. This is a game made for action fans. And I would say for Resident Evil fans, I enjoyed it a lot. But yeah, I mean, the DLC campaign with Jill and Chris taking place in a prequel, that was more of classic Resident Evil. But the next DLC taking place with Josh and Jill was another more action-focused game. I think that was freaking amazing, though. Like, it was just, like, high-octane action. Granted, professional difficulty was a nightmare. That's evident in the cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases, and on-rails turret sequences, and the constant rattle of assault rifles. Even its visual design invokes the sandy shades of military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s. I actually would disagree with that. It sets the tone for Africa because in the first town you're in, it's covered in sand in a very desert-like area, but then eventually it gets more industrialized with more hard metals and more rain effects. It all speaks to a series that it's lost its way rather than to reflect on the tenets of where the foundations of its existence. Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt to find a new lease on life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's ugly and unwieldy as it sounds. This is absolutely wrong. I've played every one of these franchises, and no, Resident Evil 5 does not play like Gears of War. The presentation, not at all. Like, both games are radically different from one another. This is like comparing Mass Effect to Gears of War. Yeah, they're both third-person shooters, but no. Completely different tones, settings, presentations, lore. Overall, like, yeah, it's not the same whatsoever. Whereas Gears of War deals more with hardened militaristic societies, Resident Evil is more about biological weapons and terrorism. The design appears to be not just a misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also misreading of its predecessor. Now, I argue against this because, yeah, if you see that an entire market is gravitating towards this type of element, you're going to try and capitalize that as much as you can. You can't really argue with the market, so yeah. But granted, yeah, it is Resident Evil. With Resident Evil 4, director Shinji Mikami definitely reinvented the series through the use of a new over-the-shoulder camera angle. The perspective allowed for a more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the terror in the core of Resident Evil, though use of enemies that were strategically placed to provide undiluted waves of tension and fear, and the inclusion of Ashley as your vulnerable charge. Combat encounters were focused on survival, overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. That is true. Also, Ashley was not a combatant. She wasn't trained in this stuff, as opposed to Sheva, who was a highly trained agent. Not to mention Chris Redfield, who has experienced so many horrors by the time of Resident Evil 5 that this has become second to none for him. Like, there's this iconic scene in Resident Evil 5 where when you get to the tribal areas and the isolated areas that Alexia and Wesker used as test subjects because they chose isolated areas so no one would ever know this was happening, the first thing Sheva says is that, I don't remember her exact quotes, but she said something in the line of being both angry and sad, like, oh my god, what have they done to them? Whereas Chris just starts shooting, because Chris has already dealt with so many of these types of infections and horrors, it becomes second nature to him. He's like, he knows instinctually that they can't be saved. They're already gone, and if you don't kill them, they will kill you. Sheva does the same thing. She starts shooting because she knows deep down that you can't save them. It reminds me of I feel like if they do remake the game, they could do something a little more with that, like how Meryl and Solid Snake first encounter a horde of enemies, and Snake tells her, you either shoot or you die, and this is the first time she actually takes a life. It's horrific for her because she's never taken a life, and now suddenly she's mowing down large amounts of soldiers because, yeah, if she doesn't shoot and help Snake, they're going to die. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Yeah, because it's an action horror game, that's how it goes. You fight waves of enemies, and they get stronger as you go along. Their purpose is cannon fodder as a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. Yeah. And those levels are not locations to be explored. Also right, yeah. Instead, they're just largely funnels that push you from entrance to exit. Resident Evil 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete locations in an attempt to move away from backtracking heavy design of its previous games, but it preserved the spirit of locations like the Raccoon City Police Station, the village, Salazar's Castle, and the island feature interlocked in explorable paths that solidified these locations as authentic spaces rather than obstacle courses. Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of its stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. The lack of authenticity means that no one will ever mention the Kujuja Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. Yeah, so what? Like, just because they're not going to be iconic doesn't mean people don't remember them. I remember almost every major location in Resident Evil 5 because they were so distinct and new. Capcom did an incredible job of showcasing the locations, so when you play through the game, you know exactly what you're going to get, what enemies you're going to encounter. Like, they're distinct enough that you know what you're getting. So, yeah, they're not iconic like the Spencer Mansion or the Baker House, but I would say they did their job correctly by maintaining the presentation of the game itself, with caves, deserts, and even the tanker level. This is a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror. Well, unless you count Resident Evil 3. I mean, it was a major commercial success, but critically, a lot of people are very divided on the game. I would say it's good. If you get it for like 20 or 10 bucks, yeah, get it. But, yeah. As this is to say that a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series' reset point, Resident Evil 7, was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew ever larger as you unlock new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinvention of the base conceit is the key to Resident Evil's success, but that dropping an unstoppable force into the house corridors, Resident Evil 2's Mr. X, or expanding the scope of the house, Resident Evil Village, to titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets and its rooms are houses. I actually am mixed about this because I feel like if they kept doing the same thing over and over, because that's why I give Resident Evil 5 more credit now. They tried something new. Even Resident Evil 6, despite it being polarizing, they did something new. Like with so many games just doing the tried and true formula, I give Capcom credit for trying new things with this franchise. They're just saying, hey, yeah, you get an Operation Raccoon City here and there, but occasionally you get a Resident Evil Revelations, and you get a Resident Evil The Dark Umbrella Chronicles, which is a light gun game that a lot of people enjoy. I think it's a fantastic game. So, the fact that Capcom just tries new things, I think they should be credited for that. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design. Because it's not meant to be that. It's meant to be its own thing set in Africa. I'm pretty sure set in a giant manor in Africa in the same way that Lady Demetru's castle is set would just be contradictory to the whole setting of Africa, I feel like. Like, a lot of people would be like, there just happens to be a giant manor in the middle of nowhere. Like, I don't know. I feel like that would be very tonally deaf as opposed to seeing that in Romania, which kind of fits the setting. Granted, Resident Evil is full of tropes, and I've never been to Africa, but, you know, if I'm wrong about that, let me know. I like to learn. A modern recreation of it would only further highlight its flaws, especially coming from the close proximity to the masterclass like the remake of Resident Evil 2. Well, Resident Evil 2 already had a foundation. They just took what Resident Evil 2, the original game, had and then modernized it. So, Resident Evil 5, they had an entirely new game. That game was made from the ground up with a different setting in mind. They had to make entirely new things for that. So, the remake of Resident Evil 2, I feel like that's a poor comparison because they already had an idea of what they had to do. Remake, of course, completely redefined the structure of the source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognizably an updated version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original, and so you can argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil that most need of a remake. Well, I don't know, it depends on how you feel about it. Especially, I don't want to spoil it, but Resident Evil 4, the DLC, establishes that there is something they're planning for the remake that's completely different. Especially with Resident Evil 4, where they kind of showcases the evolution of Leon's character. Like, when you play Resident Evil 2, the original, and then Resident Evil 4, Leon's character is so different that they might as well be two different people. But in Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 2's remake, it's more of an evolution of the character. You see Leon is not as naive anymore. He's much more hardened, more stoic, more dedicated. I mean, he was that in Resident Evil 2, but you see that he's very naive. He's a brand new cop. He's not like a veteran soldier like in Resident Evil 4 Remake. A whole new environmental structure and scenarios design that reins in the action, dials up the horror would be, bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes, but all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem, racism. Now this is where we get into the shit of things, like stuff that makes absolutely no sense. Set in the fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are black people. Yeah, it's set in Africa. I know, it's surprising. Africa's largest people is African, who are black. I know, it's shocking. Like if you go to the Middle East, where my dad's from, you'll meet a lot of brown people. If you go to Japan, you'll meet a lot of Japanese people. In Resident Evil 2, you fought white people because it was set in America. Resident Evil 7, you fought white people in the way of the Baker's family. The molded, they were also white people because it was set in Louisiana. I know, it's very shocking. Like, not everything is like the That 70s Show remake where somehow Wisconsin has the most diverse collection of people. You're just like looking at this and you're like, what the fuck? Yes, technically it's the Ouroboros virus that the protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting. They still don't mention Sheva. Sheva is also the protagonist. They're both the protagonists of the game. Sheva is not Chris's... It just hurts my mind. Sheva is also the protagonist. Both her and Chris are the protagonists of the game. Like, stop treating Sheva like this. But the parasite's host is also depicted as nations of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Okay, this is 100% a lie. You never, ever see the native people before the infection. In fact, the opening scene of the game has Chris drive into the location, meeting Sheva, and you see everyone's infected. Even Chris is aware of it. He's not saying anything because he knows what's happening. And you can see in the background, it does incredible jobs with visual presentation and storytelling. You see the infected beating the natives and then trying to kidnap them to infect them. Because in that first stage, you see that all the infected are kidnapping not only the natives, but tourists as well. In fact, the first major, I would say, mini-boss encounter is a white woman who gets infected. They literally hold her down and shove the parasite into her mouth. It's just like, what are you talking about? They're running in fear. There is never a depiction that they're violent or... oh my god. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as a dark continent. No, it doesn't. It never does that. Where are you getting this information? As uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. No, it does not. They go there because they have reports of infection, which, they're right. The second you walk into the town, everyone's infected. So, wrong about that. They are infected. 2. Wesker and Alexia, who infected the populace, specifically chose that location because it was isolated. They infected not only the natives within this town, but also the tribal people because they were used as test subjects. Because guess what? Umbrella did the same thing in Raccoon City. They opened orphanages in order to get children in those orphanages who they used as test subjects. It's par from the course. Wesker is familiar with this because what's the best way to ensure that the population of the other regions of the world are not aware of your BOW experiments? You go to isolated areas where there is no like isolated areas. Like, again, Romania in the Resident Evil Village. You go to an isolated Romanian village where people don't know what the hell's going on to the point that they worship Mother Miranda as a holy figure, not aware that she's using the people as test subjects to reborn her lost child. I went on I have to build this foundation because everything they're saying is absolutely wrong. This is insensitive treatment of people of color who was hardly debated even as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer, with the writers such as Nell DeCoral and Stephen Totilo pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. What the fuck are you talking about? They're completely ignoring the fact that Chris goes to a native person who is specially trained, Sheva, in order to try and traverse this land because guess what? Reports of infected people are there. They're completely ignoring the fact that you play as two protagonists. One of them is Sheva. She is black. She is native. The arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release, with the IGN's former editor-in-chief Hillary Goldstein having wrestled with this subject. So let's see all these. 1, 2, 3. So this is the Corel article, Web Archives, Wayback Machine, taking a long time to load. Nothing showed up here, okay? Nothing showed up here either. Oh my god. Even the police are on my side. They're going... This article is so bad, they're just like, we gotta go. What is with Western media trying to police the other end of the world? Like, we already, as Americans, we get already a bad rap of having to police the other countries of the world. And now we're just like policing what entertainment Japanese companies like Capcom can do. Like, I saw, like, there was a huge argument between the creator of Power Girl and how he was arguing against, like, Magna. And I was just like, how do you have the right to criticize what an entire culture does with their entertainment? Like, dude, this is fucking bullshit, man. But that was in 2009, a time when race apparently a debate rather than a reality. In 2020s, in a oh my god. Post-Black Lives Matter world, there is no one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans in a video game. No. This person completely ignores that there are two main protagonists in this, Sheva and Chris. Not to mention the Special Forces unit led by Josh. Josh is a native African. He is shooting them as well. Why? They are infected. They will kill anyone who is not infected on sight. Heck, they even kill other infected on sight. We fight an El Gigante who literally wears the bodies of other specialized forces. Josh's men, it kills them and then wears their bodies on its body. I'm just really confused by this. This person is purposely ignoring the other black characters in this game. Frickin' Josh, frickin' Sheva. There's also another character that saves Josh and Jill. Oh my god. Remakes may not be redefined their source material, but there's only so many changes you can make until it's not a remake at all, but an entirely new game. So I really hope this person establishes what they should change. Like, let's see what they're going to change. You're in Africa, you're fighting Africans. Like, this person doesn't mention, like, if you have such a problem with this, then why don't you have a problem with Ethan Winters, an American, shooting Romanians? Or how about in Resident Evil 4, Leon Kennedy, he goes to Spain, he shoots a bunch of Spanish people. Like, if you have a problem with that, you have a problem with that. Because Leon's an American, he goes to Spain, shoots a bunch of infected Spanish people because, yeah, they kill anyone on sight who isn't affected. Ethan Winters, an American, goes to Romania, shoots a bunch of Romanian people. I'm just genuinely like, they do not see the contradictions of what they're saying right now. And they're purposely ignoring the actual black characters in this game and just focusing on the fact that Chris is white. What the fuck does it matter that Chris is white? What does it matter? He's a specialized agent who is supposed to be deployed against global terrorisms involving BOWs. I don't think there are a lot of people like that, especially given Chris's training and hands-on experience of dealing with these types of shit situations. Like, did we forget the entire events of Code Veronica and Resident Evil 1, where he dealt with people turning into horrific BOWs that he had to take down? I don't think so. Remakes, oh wait, we read that. And if you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5, is it Resident Evil 5 anymore? No, it's not! It's not Resident Evil 5 anymore! It's set in Africa! Even with vastly improved, more sensitive take on a continent, perhaps one with a black protagonist, and it doesn't even mention her name! Just says black protagonist. Her name is Sheva. What's your problem with naming Sheva Sheva? Like, I'm getting genuinely angry here. You're omitting critical information here. Like, Josh and Sheva. Two very profound characters in the game that are paramount to not only Chris's survival, but freaking Jill's survival. If it wasn't for Josh, she would have died. I find this really funny. Not funny, angry. A more empathetic look at the outbreak. The experience would simply be too divorced from the original and hold the Resident Evil name of Resident Evil 5. What do you mean an empathetic look at the outbreak? What are you talking about? The parasite infects people and turns them into violent monsters. That is the core of it. You fight a giant spider, for the love of God. Like, what about Chris's men? Like, Chris's men gets literally destroyed, mutilated, and turned into a horrific monster made of worms. Like, yeah, I'm genuinely, like, because this just hurts my soul. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. So, yeah, we just want we want to police the game that you develop. How dare you develop the game that you want to? How dare they have an infection which acts like the same infections from all the other Resident Evil games, where people become violently angry and start killing each other. So where does Capcom go? No, personally, I'd look backwards. Code Veronica is an ideal candidate. Well, you have a problem there because I forgot where Code Veronica takes place. Let's look. So Code Veronica takes place in France. Wouldn't you? This entire article then could have just been written like, yeah, France. What about France? You're perfectly okay with shooting French people? I'm pretty sure they took the people they experimented on from France. You know, get the natives there. Oh my God. So, yeah. But it's only way chronologically forward, then totally rewrite what's to come next in the logical path. Because what followed Resident Evil 4 was not one terrible game, but two. Resident Evil 6 doubled down, no triple down, on the action-packed set heavy shooter design to extent that much of it could be mistaken for a third-person Call of Duty spin-off, where if not for the monsters, its restrictive level design practically puts you in a chokehold, forcing you to endure a barrage of bombastic moments that have no interest in invoking any sense of fear. It just seems like this person hates Resident Evil 5 and 6 so much that they're just picking things out. Like, if you don't like it because it's heavily action focused, that's fine. What this person's saying, that's completely valid. You don't like it because it's not survival horror in the original games that you fell in love with. It's action horror and you don't like that. That's perfectly fine. But the whole argument about Resident Evil 5 being racist is complete bullshit. 100%. You don't even have the courage to announce Shiva's name or completely ignore Josh. Resident Evil 6 is a survival horror only, and it's a horrible game that you have to survive playing. No, it's not. I actually didn't play Resident Evil 6 until years later because people kept telling me how bad it was. It wasn't bad. It was actually really good. Was it better than the other Resident Evil games? No, I would say that Leon and Ada's campaign are definitely the highlight of the game. Like, Chris and Sherry's campaign, definitely the low point of the game, but Ada's campaign was freaking amazing. I loved it. It was absolutely poggers. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. In Resident Evil 4 Remake's post-credit scene, evil mastermind Albert Wesker plants his detail for world domination to Ada Wong. Reflected in his glasses is an image of Alexia Giannani, and the Stairway of the Sun, two significant plot elements from Resident Evil 5, which indicates Capcom's intentions, but there's more to consider. This scene is largely a replication of the sequence from Assignment Ada, a non-canon chapter from the original Resident Evil 4. Its shift from unofficial to canon points to a willingness to change. I mean, again, they've changed some elements of Resident Evil 4. Like, for example, Ada fights the, I can't say it, but okay, she fights the experiment. She does, as opposed to Leon, and Leon never goes through the laser trap. Ada does that as well. Not to mention there's a brand new, unique enemy in Ada Wong's campaign that was never in the Resident Evil 4 original game, so they have shown that they're adding and subtracting certain elements of the game and shifting them to other ways. Furthermore, the end of the scene is entirely rewritten when learning of Wesker's plan rather than to dutifully deliver stolen Lost Plaga sample to him. Ada betrays her shadowy boss and forces her helicopter pilot to turn around. In this moment, the future Resident Evil becomes unclear. So this person definitely did not play Resident Evil 4's DLC, the remake, because I don't want to spoil it, but even though she flew away with the parasite, Albert Wesker does still get the parasite through another means. In fact, it makes it very clear of why he's there, and he anticipated the entire event because Wesker is really good at planning. Capcom has given itself the freedom to do whatever it wants. I just hope it's not a remake of Resident Evil 5. And so that's the article. So this person is just angry because they didn't like Resident Evil 5 and 6, which is fine. A lot of people don't like Resident Evil 5 and 6 because of its shift to action horror, and loved Resident Evil 7 for its callback to horror. But when it comes to this, Resident Evil 5 is not racist. Come on, it's not. This person doesn't ever mention Sheva and Josh's name. In fact, I will literally do control find. Sheva. And just to prove it, one sec. Sheva, there you go, and Josh, neither one. Not mentioned throughout the article. They completely forget to mention the two black characters who are so paramount to the story that if it wasn't for them, Wesker wouldn't have died, Jill would have died, Chris would have died. Like, Sheva and Josh saved their lives. And yeah, it's a big surprise that in Africa you will fight Africans who are infected. You know, it's a big shocker. So this person has a problem with that because Chris is white, which makes no sense whatsoever. I don't see why Chris's race has anything to do with it, because he's a specialized BOW counter-terrorist agent who has both real life and formal training in dealing with this shit, such as in Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil Code Veronica. So you would send someone who's seasoned to an unknown location where the populace is likely infected in order to ensure that the situation is dealt with. You know, you send your best of the best in that situation. Plus, this could be argued for any Resident Evil game. Well, almost any Resident Evil game. Like in Resident Evil 4, Leon is a white guy. He goes to Spain, shoots Spanish people because they're infected and can't be saved. Resident Evil 6, you go around the world shooting people of different walks of life, from China to Eastern Europe. So many different people from many different backgrounds. And guess what? Chris is still white. Leon is still white. Resident Evil 7, where Ethan Winters, he's an American white guy. He goes to, in Resident Evil 8, he goes to Romania, shoots a bunch of Romanians because, guess what? They're infected and have been turned into werewolves. So, do you have a problem with that as well? Like, this entire argument that Resident Evil 5 is racist, I just find it laughably stupid, because it's just a hallmark of Western civilization, specifically America, where they feel like they have to police what other companies do in other regions of the world. I think that's I would argue that's why Japanese media and Korean media are doing so well. They make incredible forms of entertainment, anime, manga. That one of the best shows I've watched in recent memory in the last several years is All of Us Are Dead. It's a Korean drama zombie apocalypse movie. It's freaking amazing. And they literally go, or recent Japanese games like the Yakuza franchise, Final Fantasy. It's just like, I'm getting tired of this shit. And look, Resident Evil 5 is not racist. It's a good game where you shoot people of native descent within Africa because they're infected with a deadly parasite and the Ouroboros infection. And if you don't stop them, they'll go around infecting other people, which they literally show in the beginning of the game. But, yeah. I've rambled on enough. I feel like I've said my piece. I don't want to keep going. I feel like I'll just repeat everything I stated. But tell me what you think in the comments below. What do you think about all this? I actually do hope they make Resident Evil 5 Remake, because I am really interested to see how they do it. Like a co-op game, or maybe they might not do it co-op. They might do it like a separate campaign for Sheva and Chris. Like where one campaign you play as Chris, one campaign you play as Sheva, and they only reunite occasionally. That might be really fun. Like a different take on it. Or they might just go full co-op with everything again, which I'm okay with. But tell me what you think in the comments below. I like to hear other people's opinions. If I got something wrong, right, or whatever. Like, dislike, sub, your choice. That's it from me. Bye.